about World War II. And two things to say. We could have a course on World War II. You can take an entire course on World War II. There's so much you could cover. We are going to give a very superficial treatment to World War II, and we're going to look at it mostly from the Soviet perspective, and on top of that, from the Soviet perspective coming from the center. As opposed, and what I mean by that is that there is the Soviet Union is recreates the territory of the Russian Empire filled with lots of different nationalities, and those are very important stories. I teach a class on Russian Empire, and we're that I encourage you to take. But for this story, we're going to stay mostly centered on the Soviet central experience. Um, Speaking of experience, I want to start out by just sharing a couple of images that I took myself and a little anecdotal story. We The presence of World War II looms so large in Soviet life. And I first visited the Soviet Union as a high schooler, part of a people to people program. People to people was an exchange program started by the US government under Dwight D. Eisenhower prior to the foundation of the Peace Corps. And it was an effort to establish communications, encourage learning, mutual understanding, and, if you will, a soft power agenda of the United States government. We are living in a moment where that intention to cultivate soft power connections, aid, etc., has is very much under question, and the current regime has even dismantled USAID, the organ that is responsible for aid. So you're living, if I grew up in a moment where it was understood that soft power is a good thing, it kind of maybe slightly hard to quantify, but overall, the relatively small costs, and by that I mean relative to war, are far worth it to invest. You're living in a moment where that premise is very much contested. At any rate, it was through the program, People to People, that first sparked my first encounter with starting to learn about the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution and the Russian Empire. And so in many ways, perhaps I am very much a product that I am a professor talking to you about the history of the Soviet Union today is in many ways a product of that federal program to cultivate exchange that I, as an American beneficiary started to learn about a different part of the world that has continued to fascinate me. And so these are pictures from the summer of 1991 when I was able to go as a student on this tour in the Soviet Union. It was mind blowing. We visited Kiev, Moscow, Leningrad. It was still Leningrad. We visited Almaty in Kazakhstan, which used to be the capital of Kazakhstan. That's been changed. We visited Lake Baikal out in Irkutsk. I swam in one of the cleanest lakes in the world, or it was clean. We'll talk about how a paper mill started to pollute those oh so pure waters. But these pictures are pictures that I took as a high schooler, not knowing anything. And this is some evidence of how large the legacy of World War II looms in it loomed in Soviet society. And on the top, you see this was out in actually, this isn't a picture I took myself. The top picture is a picture of a May Day celebration where veterans come out and they would wear their medals, and children that might not even know them, you walk up to these people and give them flowers to celebrate and thank them for their service. This picture is a picture of a man and a woman who also served, but one of the real takeaways to understand about Soviet society, and we'll revisit, is that when I was there and walking around, there were far fewer old men than old women. And in some ways, I even in the 90s, witnessed still remnants of that massive demographic event that eliminated so many Soviet citizens. The death toll of World War II was massive, and it meant that into the 90s, there were a lot more women than men because so many men died. The two pictures on the bottom I did take, and these are pictures where women and men, when they got married, weddings were now a civil ceremony, and you would have your civil wedding, and then you go to the local World War II memorial in your town, and you pay your respects to the veterans that suffered in that war. I mean, think about it. How many of you, if you're married, if you've been to a wedding in the United States of America, for example, or any other country, in how many of those weddings is a standard part of the day that the wedding happens and then the bride and groom go to the World War II memorial to pay their respects? This was the standard. This is how things were done. It's one small example of how large World War II loomed in life. And I noticed that one of the things that Putin's regime is has very proactively engaged in is a recentering and in, an invigoration even of the memorialization of World War II. And as I mentioned before, a heroic memorialization. I talked to you about Victory TV channel, TV Победа, to kind of cultivate an attachment to World War II, which is a heroic legacy for the Soviet Union, although it starts out quite grim, as we'll talk about. Now, when one of the take-home points I want us to take from World War II is the massive, massive death toll. We'll come back to this graph, but this is, in some ways, it feels callous to try and, yeah, pardon me. It feels a bit callous to try and talk about. Oh, why is that? Ay, ay, ay. Huh, oops. All right, scratch that. It feels a little bit callous to kind of talk in terms of numbers. Every number is a life. But this graph shows you that in absolute numbers, no one even comes close to the Soviet Union in terms of total life lost. The orange line represents civilian deaths. The red line represents military deaths. And you see that that number from the Soviet Union reaches up into the 20, 22, 23 million people range. And quite roughly, about half civilian, half military, probably a bit more to the side of civilian. The other thing to turn your attention to is the blue line is the total number of deaths as a percent of the population of these countries in 1939. And it'll jump right out that as a percentage of population, Poland, no one loses a greater percentage of population than Poland, followed by Lithuania and Latvia, the small Baltic states that get brutally hammered in World War II. And the Soviet Union loses on the ballpark of 13% of its total population. We'll come back to this and we'll talk a little bit more of about that. So, the kind of first 2 points I just wanted to make was that one, the legacy of World War II loomed large in Soviet society. And some even said that World War II came to replace the revolution of 1917 as a kind of determining pivotal moment. What do I mean by that? Well, the revolution is of 1917 and the Civil War and the early regime. Um, from it emerged many heroes. Of course, as we heard, many of them were eliminated in the purge. But in society, where were you in the revolution? What was your role? What did you do? This kind of became a point of departure for, say, a job interview or something like that. And so that was this unifying, connecting experience. We come into the 1940s, fewer and fewer people who lived through the revolution are there. And in the wake of World War II kind of became this defining event in terms of where were you in the war, that could, orient people in relation to each other. That's sort of another example of how massive it was. As I said, I'm going to give you just a very superficial overview of World War II. And from a Soviet perspective, the events that I will want you to really know about ever after, this is like stuff at a cocktail party 20 years from now, 25 years from now, if we still have cocktail parties, you should know about. Um, and that is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact. After all, the people who decide this is going to happen are Hitler and Stalin. You read about this, reading about Yalta a bit. And they make this agreement in the summer of 1939, effectively about if we'll both attack Poland and divide it, or we will not engage in aggression against each other should one of the other parties happen to violate Polish space. Um, and then, sure enough, Germany invades Poland in September of 1939, and Russia counter invades just a couple weeks later. I think the Germans invaded September 1st, 1939, and the Soviet armies move in from the eastern end on September 17th. The Winter War, the is another event I want you to know about. This is 1939-40. In the tumult, Russia will Russia will invade Finland, and in that invasion, it will not achieve all of its aims. But one consequence of that invasion is that Russia will be ousted from the League of Nations, bringing that institution that the United States under Woodrow Wilson's vision of kind of a rules-based world order, that first iteration comes to an end. Then Germany, June 22nd, 1941, Germany, under Operation Barbarossa, begins to invade Russia. Talk more about that. I'll want you to know about the Leningrad blockade. And then we'll put on our timeline the Battle of Stalingrad, a hard-fought, painful battle in which Soviet losses are greater than German losses, but the Soviets technically win the battle. And this is a moment where we really see that the war is turning, that now the tide is turning. By the time the big three meet at Yalta, it is, and that's even later, but by the time they meet at Yalta, there is this trajectory, since Stalin, where they are clawing back territory from Germany, perhaps, and there's a sense that will win, although no one, that the Allies will defeat the Axis powers led by Germany, but it's unclear just when that will be. And then in Russia, the war ends Victory Day, Victory Europe Day. The Germans officially surrender on May 9th, 1945. This, in all my time in the night in Russia in the 90s, May 9th was a massive holiday. No one worked. People were out in the streets. There were kind of parades and a day off and just commemoration of World War II. So, in very stark terms, those are kind of some of the days that I want you to go through as I talk to you a bit about World War II. Now, an important moment that is one all of you are probably aware of is Munich, the Munich Agreement. You've heard this. The Munich Agreement brings us appeasement, and basically that was in the wake of Hitler in 19 and Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany, annexes the Sudetenland. And this is a map of Germany and Czechoslovakia. And the Sudetenland is kind of land around the rim of eastern Czechoslovakia, or known as the Sudetenland. And he annexes that. And he says this should be German lands. And this is a crisis since there's been no, since World War One, we've had this peace, and there's been no annexing of a territory by major powers. And so so the European leaders meet, and the representative of England, Neville Chamberlain, is very famous, if not notorious, for saying we have achieved peace in our time by basically saying, okay, you took that, but don't take any more. We have achieved peace in our time, and is the result that from this emergency meeting in Munich, where it is decided, well, we won't take any military action against Hitler. We'll just warn him that we don't like that. And I bring this up because when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, there were murmurs of this again. Why is there not a greater response? Well, on the one hand, you don't want to escalate, and Putin won't do that again. And we recognize that he wanted the Russian Black Sea fleet was stationed in the Black Sea in Crimea. That's a reasonable concern, and so we found a way to, aside from sanctions, not have a very strong unified response with the idea that, well, he won't take any more. And so in back to 1938, there was this idea that, well, he won't take any more. And one of the rationalizations that was found to make the decision that this can pass, this territorial theft can pass, was that, well, most of the people are German anyway. And so that maybe if you're thinking of the world in terms of ethno-national, bringing ethno-national principles, that like the nation is a real primordial thing, and that there are just some people in the nation and some people that aren't, then that kind of an action pass that will bring all these Germans together. And now this is an idea that's quite different from an idea of civic nationality, that it isn't your blood that determines whether you belong to a nation, but it is your civic identity, that you adhere to the laws and rules of the nation of which you want to be a part. The United States is founded on a civic identity. Although there are people right now that uh, would prefer a an identity based in whiteness, um, and an identity that is mutually exclusive of a civic national identity. And when I say exclusive, these ideas cannot exist together. You can't have a nation that says, well, national identity is determined by whiteness versus national identity is determined by a civic allegiance. They can't both exist together in any sort of harmony. So at some ways, some people might see that the United States is a nation. This question needs to be decided again. Um, and questions of nationalism and ethno-nationalism really emerged for us in the 19th century. So what is a nation? And so we see a mix. The United States self-consciously rejected the notion that ethnicity or race determines belonging in a nation. Um, but it betrayed that concept itself in World War II. The Japanese internment camps, for example, were a betrayal of that principle. People became suspect because of their race. At any rate, that sense that maybe there is a place for race in determining what should be the nation was one of the underlying premises of the Munich decision to not escalate against Adolf Hitler. I want to show you a map as well, because as you know, I study maps. This is a map produced in the 30s that Germany produced. And what you see here is in black is Germany. And then you see Czechoslovakia down there in the lower right-hand corner. And emanating from Czechoslovakia are planes, warplanes, kind of spreading out in the direction of Germany. And cartographers have noticed that this map is a brilliant use of propaganda. If you, relative to Germany, Czechoslovakia is very, very small. And yet this map sends some sort of message that Czechoslovakia is a looming threat. So I just wanted to show you some of the ways we're going to look a lot more at propaganda, and you can see some of the ways in which propaganda is mobilized and deployed. The all right. So back to kind of what happened. So Hitler and Stalin make this pact, and then quite quickly, I mean, 1939, and then Hitler moves quickly. He invades Poland, Russia counter invades, um, and when Germany invades Poland, this is when Britain gets into the war to defend Poland. And as the Allies will ultimately win, but Britain, Britain's first move and first purpose of defending Poland is not achieved. Poland will end up not sovereign and independent, but behind the Iron Curtain. And so here, Stalin is taken quite by surprise. And many people have said he's deeply unprepared. And that's somewhat argued, as even Kotkin talks about. It's not just that he was completely unprepared, but there is a lot of information coming in and a lot of disinformation coming in that made it seem suspect that maybe Stalin wouldn't, that maybe Hitler wasn't going to attack when he was. So now I want to bring us to this morning of June 22nd, 1941, about 4 a.m. Operation Barbarossa starts, and you have 153 German divisions. They formed three groups and they start moving. In the north, tanks start rolling towards the Baltics. In the center, they start rolling eastward in Poland. In the south, they're going into Ukraine. And the Soviets are caught totally by surprise. And one of the questions has been how? How did this happen? After all, when Stalin is pushing modernization and industrialization in the late 20s and the 30s, he is doing so from very much from a geopolitical perspective that we will have to defend ourselves against the West and quite likely Germany. So he's been trying to prepare for that eventuality. And he and it's understood that Stalin understood that war with Germany was coming. Well, if wars with Germany is coming, why do we have this Hitler-Stalin pact? Why does he make this agreement of non-aggression? And the reason that historians give is that he wanted to delay the conflict that he understood coming. He didn't think the Soviet Union was ready yet. It was well understood that Germany was militarizing tremendously. And then, so in the grand scheme, he knows it's coming, but he thinks it's not coming yet, perhaps. But even at a more granular level, there was a good amount of there was a good amount of intelligence saying they're going to invade. They don't have the satellite technology to watch the movements of troops that we have now, but there's an understanding that there's a military buildup happening. And I can't help but, as I think about this, think about the invasion of Ukraine, where Putin's hostility towards Ukraine was well known. But in the lead up to 2022, there was many inside and outside of Russia were taken deeply by surprise that this happened when it did. Even as in the previous 2 years, satellites had observed they've observed the military buildup along Ukraine's borders. But in the moment, in the 2 years leading up to that, there had been many such buildups, right? So we'd seen this sort of thing, and oh, is Putin posturing? Is he gesturing? They're just doing an exercise. They want to scare the West. They're not really going to attack. And so, in the context of there'd been numerous buildups and then receding of Soviet equipment, um, it seemed that it wasn't like he's going to invade Ukraine, right? It's like, what is he up to? He's trying to send signals to the West. In December 21, he'd actually send this letter of demands that were completely unreasonable, which full disclosure, I read as a kind of signal. All right, I want to come back to the fold and no longer be isolated and have these sanctions. What I want to do is for the rest of the world to recognize the annexation of Crimea as kind of a starting salvo of negotiation. Full disclosure, that's how I read that December 21st list of demands that Putin sent to the UN. But in retrospect, the history books will probably read, well, gosh, he was just building up like tons of divisions and people, although it was a little harder to see the people moving on the borders of Ukraine. Of course, he was going to attack. Well, in the summer of 1941, we can say, well, Hitler was building, there was this buildup. Of course, he was going to attack. It's easy to say in retrospect. But at the moment, there was also so there's ambiguity about how to read what's happening in the moment. There's also a lot of disinformation. Hitler intentionally, as the Soviets did too, in the world of espionage, send out kind of false flags of what's going to happen. And so it can be a bit difficult to discern what's what. And Stalin had gotten many reports that an attack from Hitler was imminent. Um, and And so from Stalin's perspective, even now, many records show is that Stalin, Hitler had been amassing equipment on the Western Front, and Stalin believed that Hitler was doing that to avoid British air raids. He believed, for the moment, Hitler's explanation that he moved his forces from the east in order to protect them from air raids from potential British attacks. The Soviet government, in the lead up to June 22nd, 1941, had received or ascertained 80 different warnings that an attack was imminent. But Stalin didn't quite think it was coming. He thought Hitler was busy. He probably misunderstood Hitler's personality at some level. And he ignored the advice of General Zhukov, his general in May 1941, advised Stalin to launch a preemptive attack against Germany because he thought that that would disorganize Germany. It was very clear that Germany was militarizing. And as I said, the Soviets were apace as well. In 1941, Soviet defense outlays amounted to over 43% of the country's GNP, gross national product. And so, and the Soviet army had 2.8 million soldiers, like in uniform, and the Germans had about 3 million. So there is definitely a kind of escalation in the military scene between these rival powers, separated only by Poland. And, so what to do? Now, Stalin actually even got information from a spy, Rudolf Hess, that the attack is coming on June 22nd. And on June 14th, 1941, the rumors were so rampant that the Soviet news printed in the press a repudiation of rumors that Germany was going to attack Russia. From Stalin's perspective at this moment, his number one concern was accidental war as a danger. He wanted to make sure there was no provocation. And in fact, at 1 a.m., 3 hours before Operation Barbarossa begins, Stalin issues orders to Soviet military commanders not to shoot even if Germans penetrated Soviet territory. We don't want a dangerous provocation. So when Operation Barbarossa is really underway, Stalin was he was really thrown for a loop. And he kind of, people don't see him for a minute. He's a bit paralyzed. It's even said that he almost evacuated Moscow, that he even went to the train station and changed his mind to stay. We'll have to look on a map. Moscow isn't so far inland from the territory. And his daughter wrote that within half an hour of departure, he called his chief bodyguards and said, "We're not going, we're staying." And so Stalin decided to stay and ordered, we've got a war to fight, but the PR, the public relations, the propaganda can never be turned off. And they ordered a big parade on Red Square. Stalin quickly made an effort to negotiate another Brest-Litovsk peace, but Hitler, thinking he's on the verge of taking Moscow, I have really surprised them, and in the initial push, they take a good amount of territory. He refused. So Stalin blundered. The cost of that blunder was tremendous. 56% of all military casualties suffered by Soviets in World War II were suffered in the first 18 months of the war, from June 1941 to December 1942. The war was a total of 47 months for Russia. So another Another consideration that here, bringing us back to the purges, is that Stalin was taken by surprise, even as it was clear some conflict was in the future. He was taken by surprise, but the Soviet leadership had also been decimated. This is a legacy of the terror. In June 1937, one of the leading marshals, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, and seven other prominent Soviet officers had been convicted of treason, disloyalty to the state. And this was taken as a sign by the secret police that, okay, it's time to go after the army. And that they did. The numbers are still unclear, but it's estimated that somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 officers. That's more than a third of the total officer corps of this Red Army that Trotsky had developed. That about 35% of the officer corps were purged. And by this, I mean not fired from your job, but shot or sent to the gulag. And so in June 1941, you have a Soviet army in which three-quarters of the commanders had been in their positions for under 12 months. And the story, in many ways, of World War II is of a tremendous learning curve by the Soviets. And so they rally, and they rally through strict discipline, strict censorship. There is state control of information. We've been seeing that. We've been seeing a lot of that, but now more than ever, military organization is not civilian organization. And industrial production gets super disciplined. We've got a command economy, and so in some ways, it's a little easier to kind of get on that footing fast. If you break ranks in any ways, slacking, which is somewhat remarkable as we think about kind of the human resources deficit that this regime is going to face, and yet still really severe discipline. 2.6 million people died internally during the war. And, some of those, I don't have a number for you, but some of those are even factory workers that have misbehaved, you're out too. So like an imposition of really strict discipline. But simultaneously, there is a bit of a cultural loosening that happens. So now I'm talking, we're in society about what's happening in World War II. And symbols cultural symbols people could rally around become allowed. The church, for example, churches are allowed to reopen. Some prayer in public, praying for soldiers. This becomes allowed, which in an officially atheist regime had not been previously. Some signs of patriotism are allowed again, even for our nation. Remember, a Marxist, the Marxist ultimate vision is ones where constructs such as nation are going to be eliminated, but we see even more allowance for patriotism, for national allegiance, for traditional values, we might say. On January and towards the end of the war, January 1st, 1944, the Soviet anthem replaces the Internationale that had been the anthem of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, Orwell is drawing from history at that point. Now, to turn to the military story, within the military story, within the military, discipline is tremendously strict. On August 16th, 1941, the state issues Order Number 270. And Order Number 270 says that any soldiers taken prisoner are guilty of betraying the motherland. If you become a POW, by definition, you have betrayed the motherland. I mean, this is really one of the kind of, among many sad stories, one of the saddest is that in the wake of World War II, the POWs that were returned to the Soviet Union were almost entirely sent to the Gulag. This is an issue that wasn't really known about until Glasnost, or under Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, where he said we're going to have an openness, Glasnost openness, and people could start to research this history, research Stalin's crimes, and among them that was ranking quite high was the treatment of soldiers in World War II that got captured. Welcome back to your homeland. You're going to the Gulag because you're considered a traitor. And this even extends to Stalin's own son, was serving in the war. He's captured. The Germans reached out to him on numerous occasions. This is your son. Do you want to have an exchange? And Stalin says, keep him. There's a bit of controversy whether he was murdered or committed suicide, but Stalin's own son died in a German camp under apprehended by the Germans, despite overtures from the Germans first to make arrangements to have him back. Numbers vary, but they are generally how many soldiers met this fate, and it's probably between 1.2 and 1.8 million. And so we even see the seeds for it there in that order number 270, August 1941. So this is just weeks after Operation Barbarossa has been launched. On July 28th, 1942, order number 227 is issued. And this order says not one step back, ni shag nazad, not a step back. And this orders even if anyone tries to retreat. It's really terrifying to think about, heading towards people shooting at you. If anyone tries to retreat, you shoot them. And units even installed blocking detachments. So some of the soldiers aren't there to fight the Germans. They're there in the back to hang back and shoot any of their fellow soldiers that might get be afraid and try to retreat. So it takes brutal discipline internally for the Soviets. And this is one of the ways the Soviets managed to turn this tide. The war on the Eastern Front is especially brutal for another reason. And that reason is that in Hitler's hierarchy of cultural worthiness, as we all know, he was deeply anti-Semitic and wanted to see the elimination of Jews, which brought us the Holocaust. He also considered that Slavs were sort of Untermenschen, that they were also kind of less worthy, a less worthy race, quite low on the list. And so when Hitler launched the war in the East, he told his generals that they were engaging in a war of extermination. And it's now quite clear the Germans treated POWs of the Western Allies much better than they treated Slavic POWs. And this was all keeping with the German racial hierarchy, where Slavs were quite low on the list of races for Germans, and this all contributed to the brutality of the war. I want to talk to you about the siege of Leningrad and tell a little story. So as the Germans are closing in, and as the Germans are closing in, here's a bunch of a map just showing their movements on the Eastern Front. But up here on the top of the map, here's Leningrad, up there in the Gulf of Finland. Operation Barbarossa moves in. By September 8th, 1941, they have surrounded Leningrad, and this becomes known as the Siege of Leningrad. It lasts from September 1941 to January 1943, almost 900 days. Vladimir Putin actually had a brother he never met because he died during the siege of Leningrad. There was lots of malnutrition and hunger and sickness as this city is cut off by Germans surrounding it on both sides. Here's another. So here's Leningrad, and the Germans are able to come around here. So it's almost completely isolated. Can't get food in, can't get people out. They try to evacuate. When they understand this is happening, they evacuate even across Lake Ladoga, and then children to Kazakhstan, but they don't get everyone out. There's lots of people in the city. And one of the most moving museum exhibits I ever saw was at the Museum of the Blockade in St. Petersburg. It was Leningrad the first time I went to it. And ever after, I went to this museum many times. And it tells the story of the blockade. But what I saw the first time there, I want to show you this exhibit, and it's one of the most disturbing exhibits I ever saw. So these are three pictures of one woman. And the first picture on the exhibit dates May 1941, second, May 1942, so a year later, and then October 1942, so about a half a year later. And basically, if you look at this picture, you see a kind of young, voluptuous, healthy looking woman who in the course of less than 2 years looks like an emaciated woman in her 60s. And for me, this looking at this image was such a gut punch. It um, it seems to capture much of the experience of this horrific war and this and the hurt and being in Leningrad during the siege. A small history anecdote. So I would go to this museum all the time, and one time I actually, my father visited me in Russia, and this was now, I'm no longer a worker, but now I'm a history graduate student working in an archive just up the street about centuries earlier period in history. And I want to show my dad this exhibit, and it's gone. And so now feeling like, I work in archives too. I talk to the dejurnaya who puts me in touch with the curator, and the curator is saying, where's that exhibit that I have visited before? And she took me into a back room and she showed me a bunch of materials. She showed me the exhibit she'd taken down and additional materials. And she said, we've taken it down because we think the dates that we were advertising were wrong. Like this first picture may have been taken in the 30s. Maybe we think they, maybe in the 30s. And this other picture may be taken not October 42, but maybe as late as 1945 even. And so my takeaway from this was that, well, on the one hand, congratulations to the curator who is, really wants to make sure that the information she is putting out there is accurate. And the second take-home point that I took home is that, what, even if these pictures, and she confirmed this is the same woman, this is the same woman, even if these pictures are the dates, it's a decade that they spread as opposed to 2 years, I think that it's not less devastating in terms of the toll that the war took on people. All right, we'll stop there and pick up on Wednesday. I have office hours now, so drop in if you want to chat. Okay, have a good rest of the day.